what is strange in a way is that you've got to the point in your life when you've decided you weren't going to be an oboist, a professional oboist, and we're going to find out how quickly you transferred to what seems to the general public to be about the opposite, most far. I remember many years ago Ernest Gellner said, "Did you know Wynne used to be an oboist?" I said, "No, it couldn't be. I mean, economists are people with no soul and no aesthetics." So there seems nothing in the preparation apart from the fact that you did greats.
P.W.S. Andrews, he was the man.
Yes. But how was it that you now...
Well, I had a very difficult time. I mean, it was a very, very tough time. And stayed tough for a long time. Because how old was I? In 19... Last concert I played in was in 1952. Right at the end of the year.
About 26. You were about 26. Mm.
And then I came back, and then I fell in love with my wife, which is very soon after coming back.
This is your current wife?
Kitty, I've
Kitty.
only had one, yes.
Tell us just about Kitty, because of course she's from a very interesting
Kitty was
family.
then married to Lucien Freud, but separated. But not formally separated, but she was not. She had 2 little children, and I met her at a party, as you might in London. Party given by Freddie Eyre. And so that was a big sort of element of that period, as you can imagine. And I spent a lot of that year really having a good time. We went to Ireland, we went to France, and I tried to write my novel, which was a terrible failure. I mean, I never tried to get it published, but I tried very hard. And then eventually I realized that I had got to get a job.
You didn't mention her father.
Oh no, her father was very genial.
And his name?
Jacob Epstein.
Yes.
He was very, Epstein is, I don't know what impression you get of him, but he was a very genial man in ordinary company. He was very merry, had flashing blue eyes, and he made that bust of me in, I think, 5 sittings.
This is a bust that, what happened to it?
The bust, well, there were 2 versions of it. One was an ordinary portrait bust. I've got one, I gave it to my daughter. The other one he enlarged with a caliper and put it on the top of St. Michael of all the Angels, which stands now on the cliff at Coventry Cathedral, as I think is quite recognisable. And
you've never had someone coming up and say, "Oh, I've seen you somewhere before."
Well, I have. They do know. And that was put up in 1958. I was going to say something else, but yes, that was very, very fascinating watching him work. And you know, I always imagined if you made a bust, that you started with a thing like a football, and then cut a... No, he started with a lot of little sausages and an armature which consisted simply of a post with a cross attached to it. And he laid strips like that, endlessly laid tiny strips until it became solid and smooth on the exterior.
How strange, yes. So you build it up rather than...
Built it up, never took anything off.
It's the opposite of sculpture.
Yeah,
or
exactly. I think he died in 1959.
But you mentioned that you seem to have had a very lovely year with Kitty, and
yes.
But you said it was also a very difficult time.
Well, just because I wasn't getting anywhere. At 26, I hadn't got a job. I didn't know what I was going to do. So then, it was P.W.S. Andrews who got me an interview with an executive or in the Metal Box Company, which is a company that made tin cans and seaside pails.
Which branch were you in?
I was in a thing called infant stats. And it was, you see, because people don't help you, they don't really, but Andrews really did help me. He got me this interview, and I got a job, £60 a month. Very lowly job, and absolutely no knowledge of, more or less forgotten everything.
In stats, was it?
Yes, information and statistics.
Yeah.
But I felt very much humiliated by the insignificance of the job I held. I mean, what do you do is a question I didn't welcome.
Especially when you were mixing with people of the Kitty's background.
And Freddie, yeah, Matthew Smith. Anyway, then Kitty noticed an advertisement in the New Statesman. People looking for economists in the Treasury. So I applied for this job. I'd been swatting up, and it wasn't, of course, I'd been swatting up the national income, how to measure it, and reading a bit. But anyway, I went to an interview, which was, I found very... But it happened that I knew about some things that Robert Hall, who was the chief economic advisor of him, and I happened to know about the price of tin.
Working in the metal box company.
Yeah, absolutely. We had to know about the price of tin. Because they didn't make tin plate, but you had to know about what was going to turn into the price of tin. Anyway, I got this lowly job, and that would have been in 1956. Yes. I went into the... Epstein made the bust of me in February 1956, and I went in March to the Treasury, in a very low position, as you could imagine. And then I worked away at it. And I'm bound to say I didn't feel quite so humiliated, except on occasion. What we had to do, and what to an increasing extent I had to do, was to interpret more or less raw figures for use by the government. I mean, why it was these, and what the future would be. And there was an array of economists and statisticians from other departments who fed you with the more or less raw data and their own interpretation of it. And then I had to write a report once a month saying what had happened and what was going to happen. And then do a big forecasting exercise. Once every 6 months, on which the budget would be based, and ministers would be briefed on this. And as time passed, and other people left, I became quite an expert. I mean, how many years passed? I was promoted. And then, of course, the big change in my life, professional life, was in about 1964-65, when, well, to back up just a bit, I went, because I'd acquired all this undigested knowledge, and I went for a couple of years to the National Institute on Secondment. And I a lot of pieces which were published then on particular things which I had acquired knowledge of, humble things, like the retail price index and unemployment and humble. And that was quite, they were quite a hit at the time, and people referred to them and used them. And when I went back to the Treasury, it had all changed. It was the Labour government. And then I met Nicky Kaldor for the first time. And that, as it turned out, was a very, very big event in my life. Anyway, I formed a close relationship with him. And I did one or two quite important, quite spectacular. I mean, they were spectacular by their nature. I don't know if you can remember a thing called the selective employment tax, but it was very important in that year, which was 1966, when I had to create the statistical system for levying the tax. It was complicated because I had to raise much more money than they needed in one way and then pay it back in a different way. And then the following year, which was devaluation, and I did all the calculations. How big the devaluation should be and what the capital should be and all that sort of thing. And then I was considered to be a sort of coming man because I'd done all these very strictly Treasury things successfully, and I had a good working knowledge of the economy, in short, and how it was measured, and what was likely to happen to it, sort of. Although I now think it was very flimsy, had a very flimsy basis in theory.
Were you interested in macro theory? I mean, were you drawing on the work of Keynes or?
Well, we thought we were, but it couldn't be used in any. It couldn't be just turned into. We had our own way of modelling the economy, which, as I say, I now think was seriously inadequate. But in principle, it was Keynesian. It was Keynesian in spirit. And so then Nicky, it was his doing. He was very persuasive and very persistent. But he persuaded me to leave. So I was then an undersecretary. It was quite a senior position. And I was very well established, and I had a very beautiful house in London. He persuaded me to come to Cambridge. I'm sorry to say, from a personal point of view, I regard that as being, by a very long way, the worst thing I've ever done.
The worst?
Worst.
Well, we'll come to that. But can you tell us more about Nicky? I mean, at some point, whether this is the right point. I met him towards the end of his life, and obviously didn't get to know him at all well. But what was he? He's a very large man.
Yes.
Sideways, anyway. not.
Well, Kid McMahon made a good joke about him. I don't know about the physiology of this, but he told me there were three types. There were ectoderms and endoderms and mesoderms. And ectoderm, the cell, ecto made the bones and skeleton, and endo made the gut, and meso made the nervous system, and which corresponded to Henry V, Hamlet, and Henry V, Hamlet and Falstaff. And Nicky was the unique full staff head intellectual who thought with his gut. And that was a very sort of good thing to say about him, because although you could always, in the very end, you could pin him down to the logic of an argument. His answers flowed from his body. And that's a property I've never known in him. I mean, he never thought before he spoke, or hesitated. He emanated. He emanated thought. And, I mean, he is the one person who has been touched with genius. I mean, in a true sense, that he had kind of unlimited intake and output.
When you say the one person, one economist,
one economist
that you had met. Yeah.
Well, William Glock and Isaiah, both emanated genius. Those are the only other two, I think, that
He was one of the three academics you met who were like
Well,
that.
William Glock was not an academic, he was a performing artist, but he was also a great scholar. Well...
So getting back to why Cambridge is such a disaster.
Oh, well, let me just say some more. He was very persuasive, and he would never give up. And he used to, he used to go to sleep, because he slept at the permanent secretary. William Armstrong was the permanent secretary, very much respected. And he used to sleep at meetings of the top Treasury officials. And he was extremely greedy. We used to go to Soho. That was when Callaghan was Chancellor. And there's a story I have about that. He used to go to Wheeler's in Soho, and he always had a particular kind of sole which had a lot of cream sauce. And he was very, very much annoyed with Callaghan because it's something to do with deprived children. He said, it's devilish. And because he was eating this creamy sole, fat, in a very greedy way, I started to kid him that he wasn't being wholly sincere. And that caused him to burst into tears, because he wanted to prove to me that he did care. And then a stream of tears came down one side, and out of his mouth came the creamy sauce, and he made a kind of horrible emotion on his chin. I mean, it sort of, there was something conveys what it might have been like to be in his company. He loved laughter. It was usually at his own jokes, but not quite always. And he had his specialities. And, I mean, in economics, as well as being a very creative scholar. So, yes, well, my arrival in Cambridge.
How did he contrive a position for you at Cambridge? Or did
you couldn't resist him. And once he gets onto an appointments committee, because there were other people much better.
What appointment was it?
Director of the Department of Applied Economics.
Oh, that.
The professorial type was not a... Because you see, he wanted me not only to be head of the Department of Applied Economics, he also wanted me to be a Fellow of King's. As he was on the appointments committee, he knew that I was the new director before anybody else knew. So he immediately went to Edmund Leach and said, right...
What year is this? This is...
1970.
Same year as I was elected to King's. Right.
Anyway, he went to see the professorial quota was full. Nevertheless, Edmund immediately wrote to me a letter that arrived simultaneously with the publication of the results. So if you hang around for a bit, you'll get a fellowship at King's. Of course, it's entirely contrary to the letter and spirit of the quota business.
Mm.
And I wrote back saying, thank you very much, I'd love to hang around for a bit. And then the next post came 2 letters from other heads of houses inviting me to go and see them. So you can see it put me in a very, I felt very awkward, and I had nothing of it. I had no particular wish to be a fellow of King's rather than anybody else. Anyway, that was a great embarrassment to do with that.
How was it sorted out?
It was sorted out, let's rather. Well, you see, Burke Hill, I think you know Burke, name like Burke Hill, who was the master of Peterhouse, asked me for the weekend. And I enjoyed it. It was good fun. But I
He was master of where?
Peterhouse.
Peterhouse, yes.
And prevaricated. And then, in the end, I decided that I wasn't going to be bound down by Edmund's charitable but absolutely improper proposal, and went back to Burke and said I'd like to be a fellow of Peterhouse. Then he thought he didn't want me. So I can't tell you how embarrassing and horrible it all was. I've been used to the Treasury, which is an entirely hierarchical organisation. But as they're united in purpose, and all very clever people, you never were aware of any pressure or conflict, ever, with trivial exceptions. Well, I came to Cambridge supposing, as director of the department, that sort of more or less people would do what I tell them to do. But not a bit of it. I mean, all they thought of in relation to me was that I preserved their jobs. Because there was none of them had tenure.
It was on soft funding, was it?
Yes. And then the structure of it, the appointment structure of it, was very questionable because it became, you see, they were so anxious about me, thinking that I would try to do them down. This was bursting, so that it was difficult for me to see how I could do any of my own research.
How many people were there?
About 30, I should think. And the appointments committee of the department was the committee of management, and they all went to the previous director, who was Brian Redaway, and said, can you see if Godley will use the right of the committee of management to co-opt members, to allow them to co-opt people that we elect. So Redaway put this to me in a very neutral way. He didn't ever tolerate any such thing when he was director. Well then, as the committee of management was also the appointments committee, I was sort of structurally in a very, very bad position. Because these non-tenured people were fully operational and very highly motivated members of the appointments committee. To a short tenure, absolutely daft. I went and complained to the general board, and they didn't do anything about it. Anyway, I was very unpopular, for no reason, I mean that I could see. I wished them well. But there was a very uncomfortable feeling about it. And there were also, which I hadn't known, there were very difficult members of the assistant staff who were real troublemakers.
Assistant staff?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Computing people and that sort of thing, who were real troublemakers. So I was unhappy, just like that. And
very soon wished you hadn't made the move.
yes, I very nearly resigned on the spot. Very, very nearly. I thought it's too feeble to do that. But however, and then I wasn't properly trained as an economist, as people would recognise it. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to pass part one, because I only had my Treasury experience. But that I did have, and I had a lot of things to write about. I mean, for instance, I was special advisor to the parliamentary committee on dealing with public expenditure, which I knew a great deal of. I spent 3 years special. I mean, I'm not saying I was sort of wholly incompetent. There was a lot of policy and material that I knew a great deal about. And I also knew that the economy was very sort of badly covered in the public discussion. And I knew more than any of the journalists at that time. So I thought, well, what I shall start doing is to do my Treasury work in the Department of Applied Economics. And that was very successful, at least in the sense that it got a lot of coverage in the newspapers. And Francis Cripps, who I think, if Kaldor is a genius, Francis Cripps was and is the actual sort of cleverest economist I've known. And he left his job in the faculty. He had a tenured post and came and worked untenured as an ordinary economist in the Department of Economics. And then we started a thing together called the Cambridge Economic Policy Group, which produced reports, and bulletins and done in the Cambridge Economic Policy Group, which were evaluations of the economic situation and prospect. To begin with a special reference to public expenditure and public finance, which to begin with was, I think I can say, was very successful, at least reasonably successful. We did, but we were rather in the limelight. I mean, it got a lot of coverage in the press, and Times in particular, and in the Financial Times. I was very friendly with the main economic journalists of that time. And Francis built a model, an elaborate model of the British economy, which we used to make projections. We got a nice big grant from the SSRC as it was then. We certainly did get 1 or 3 of the big turning points right. 1974, inflation 1975, and the collapse of the economy after 79-80. We were unpopular, I would say, with almost everybody. Very pessimistic about the medium-term future, and very seriously entertained the possibility of protection as an economic strategy. which of course is very unpopular with economists. Anyway then, we had what? I suppose I had a staff of about 8. So we also wrote pieces about regional policy and about world. Francis also built a world model, very ingenious, which we're just beginning to use. And then came catastrophe, because the SSRC turned us down when it came to renewing our big grant. There was a very serious flaw in their procedure, which is that they didn't consult us. They didn't pay a site visit. So there was no possibility, they didn't put any adverse propositions.
They wouldn't do that now, I don't think. When they close things, they make great precautions for legal entanglement, so you were just unfortunate at the time.
Well, this is quite a good story about Francis Cripps, as to what a clever man he is. When I went back to the Treasury for a year, 1975, and I wanted to get a piece of computing done to prove something to those people, a piece of modelling work to be done and computerised. So I went to Francis with the equations, and I just see him. He went back into his room with his cigarette and puffed. He came out with a computer program, and he put it in, and out came the answer in 4 seconds. So as the subject was terribly secret, I didn't actually, although he knew perfectly well what it was, but I didn't say anything about it. I just asked him to solve the model. So I went back to the Treasury with this program, and after I took it, they had a sort of enormous computer in the attic, and I gave it in to them, and 4 or 5 days later they hadn't produced the answer. So I went up to them and said, what's going on? Why didn't you produce the answer? We can't understand it. I said, what do you mean you can't understand? We can't understand how it works. So I said, put it into the computer and get the answer. And they put it in and the answer came out. And they were never able to understand. Well, I'm advised that Gordon told them that that our computing system was antiquated and very slow and out of date and not respectable. It was absolutely the most brilliant thing you can imagine in reality. And the other thing, of course, was that not one of the consortium had ever actually built a model. There were people, there were econometricians, different sort of people. So, and there was no recourse, no substantial recourse. And that really was a catastrophe, because it meant that the group was broken up. Not to mention the fact that we were very publicly humiliated by the whole thing. And Francis left and went to Thailand, and virtually never, and the whole thing. But they all got good jobs. They weren't tons.
What date was this?
It was 1982. See, Francis was so clever. I never learnt to touch a computer. So I had to start doing modelling on my own. And I had 3 years. I was still director of the department, on a very much reduced scale. And but that's another whole story about that. But I started to learn modelling, taught myself modelling. And I gradually, I think I can, well, of a certain kind of modelling, I became reasonably expert. Now, in the 1978, well, it's really 1974. I started on a line of research into macroeconomic theory. I had an insight. I had sort of a Damascene insight about how the economy as a whole was put together. And I started to write about it in 1978. And then it was aside from the economy watching activities. And then I started to write it up, tried to write it up, and Frank offered me I've got the books, it's just a book called Macroeconomics, which is supposed to be a guide to macroeconomics, which, aided by the large fees it brought, I took on. And I started to write it up on Capital. And Francis joined in with me, and we published this book. And it came on stream just about the time of the debacle with
the debacle with the
sausage.
yes, SR.
And it came out, I think, in 1983. It was published. But only about 6 people thought that it was the work of genius that I thought it was. But the point was really that it was not completely, anywhere near completely thought out, the model deployed in this book. But I then had I'm not deterred in my belief in the fundamental model and fundamental idea. But from 1983, I then had a very fruitful year in Denmark, and soon after I came back from Denmark, I retired. Oh, I was coming to retirement, and I went to the States, where I was very fortunate in landing a job which was well paid, which had no duties, no teaching. And I continued.
Where was that?
At Bard. They have an economics institute there. But I continued doggedly with these 2 aspects of my work. One was writing about whatever economy I was in, and I became familiar with the United States economy, and started writing pieces which, strategic pieces about the American economy, which my employers liked. But simultaneously, I was evolving a new version of the book, substantial new version of it, and making all models myself. Well, that was incredibly engrossing. The other thing which I did, which may shock you, was I started to really understand the sort of economics that most people teach very late in the day. And in that I was very much assisted by a man you may not have heard of, called Anwar Sheikh, who is a professor at the New School. And we used to have brainstorming sessions on the neoclassical synthesis, which went on for hours and hours and days and weeks and weeks. And in the end, I came to what I now believe to be a proper understanding of the system of ideas that had been opposed to, and of course Kaldor and Co. had always been opposed to. But I came to my own version of how to oppose it. I mean, how to set it out properly, which in a sense was also a way of opposing it. So these two things came on simultaneously, a positive statement and a negative statement. And I started writing up the positive statement in bits and pieces, which got published. And then I had the great good fortune to, well, that happened in an amusing way. I had a letter from Ottawa, from a man called Marc Lavoie, and he wrote me an email saying, "We are 4 full professors and we cannot understand equation X in your paper on such and such." So I wrote back saying, "You can't understand it because it has a very bad mistake in it." And so he came to see me, and we got on very well. And he agreed to co-author the book I was then sort of more or less halfway through. Very deeply sympathetic, and a good scholar, and a good monetary economist, and a very nice man. And that's what I've been doing ever since. Except, you see, I've got the book. The book came out just over a year ago. Godley and Lavoie, called Monetary Economics.
King's, when I came to it, was
Yes.
full of economists, and Edmund used to complain about having too many economists.
Yes.
Obviously, most formidable, apart from Nicky, was, although very old, was Richard Kahn.
Yes.
What was he like?
Well, I'm afraid I couldn't get on with him in any real sense. See, the other, well, that's all a great story in itself, is how it came about that the economists most closely associated with Keynes, of whom Kaldor was not one, you know, but there were Joan Robinson and Richard Kahn and Thruffer, and in an indirect sense me.
And Pasinetti? No.
Well, Pasinetti is a junior person.
Yeah.
But Nicky became part of it. Well, I don't know that he was much personally involved with Keynes, but there was a whole, and Stone, of course, underrated man, in my opinion.
Richard Stone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Underrated by his Cambridge colleagues. But there were all these very powerful, genuinely very powerful minded people who were the direct descendants of Keynes. But they were impossible, individually and collectively. They were vain. They didn't sponsor other people's work. They were quarrelsome. They wanted to be the one, and they left no legacy. There was no, and they didn't leave a coherent body of work. This is a very important part of my own story, because I knew a lot of Kaldor's ideas. But you see, there's no Kaldorian textbook. There's no synthesis. There's no post-Keynesian synthesis, which tells you from beginning to end what the post-Keynesian view is as to how the economic system works. It's all in bits and pieces with brilliant insights. Well, to come back to your actual question, I found Richard Card very difficult to talk to, and of course Joan Robinson too. Very opinionated.
Did they listen? Not really.
Not really.
I only met Joan Robinson once. She didn't really. She seemed to be interested in what she was talking about.
Yes. Well, that's all a great tragedy. They were all very gifted. I'm not saying they weren't. But they weren't people to help you along the road. They wanted all of them to be the one. But they didn't do the thing which I'm complaining of, which is to produce a coherent statement of how the whole economy works. Of course, another important figure there is Koletsky, who is not, who thought most, he thought for himself and made it very clear that.
Was he in Cambridge?
Well, he was off and on in Cambridge. I don't know how much he was, but he was before my time. So I'm in great danger of making hostages to fortune. But if I'm to speak honestly, I mean, there's no point in speaking any other way. I believe myself, with Marc Lavoie, to have made a statement of the alternative macroeconomics, which is enough, at least, for other people to build in and to rehabilitate the, I don't know whether to call it the true, because I don't owe much to Keynes, not Keynes himself. But there is another body, there is another way of thinking about the economy other than the very influential standard neoclassical macroeconomics. American, what I'm going to say, Modigliani, Samuelson, Patinkin, for a good start. Their version of it. But I mean, it is an amazing fact that there are two paradigms deeply hostile to one another. And the post-Keynesian one has been largely routed for the time being by both with regard to teaching, appointments, publications, and the way people think. But which there have been pockets of resistance in lots of places, but they're not influenced. They've been written out of the literature. And what I believe myself to have done is to rehabilitate that in a way that none of those people would actually do. Well, they didn't do it, and I don't think they would do it now. But that's what I've done.
What is the implication? Can you spell it out again?
Well, it is an altogether different way of thinking. But it has got political, I mean, I suppose the main political implication is that the market is king. I mean, the less the government does, and the more you allow the market to function freely, whatever that may mean, that is the orthodoxy.
Can I just come back to the other side of, or part of the side of your life in Cambridge, which we haven't talked about, which is King's?
Yes.
And you were elected a professorial fellow after that difficult beginning. And one or two people who we both knew, and it would be interesting to have your views on. The first was one you mentioned, the provost at the time, Edmund Leach. How did you get on with Edmund?
I loved him. And I got on extremely well with him. What more can I say? He was a slightly, well, he was an erratic figure. He could be bad-tempered and tyrannical. But I didn't care about that. To me, he was always generous and courteous and funny and loving. That's the thing.
Did you know Celia at all?
I did. I knew them as a couple as well. And she was a very attractive compliment to him.
Did you think he was an original thinker? Or perhaps it was outside your field?
Entirely, it was right outside my field. But I didn't entirely, I suppose I should say, trust his view. So far as I could identify. I mean, I'm speaking as such an amateur. My knowledge is so trivial. But I didn't, you know, this tremendous emphasis on cooking and eating, and I couldn't. I mean, there have been anthropological books. I don't know whether they're kosher, whether you like them or not, which is really, I mean, like Patterns of Culture. They're books that really changed my life.
Did it?
Well, because I was locked into logical positivism. And I thought that life could have a meaning apart from chopping up meanings, whether we were using language the right way. I mean, and there really were interesting things to learn about other people, which couldn't be chopped up in the logical status of propositions. So that did have a great, and lots of, I mean, I've read things as a pastime, but I was never quite convinced by Edmund's views.
Another Kingsman who you mentioned was a close friend and professor of the Edward VII Professor of English Literature, Frank Kermode.
My dear friend, yes.
Tell me something about Frank.
Well, I played squash with him every week for about 20 years.
Better way of getting to know somebody.
Exactly. In fact, the piece I wrote about him in that little volume, I just called it The Opponent. And he was quite a tough opponent. He's more athletic than you might suppose. I mean, I'm not an athlete, but he often beat me, and he was very competitive. And I had a row with him once, because I had to lie down. I mean, I was out of shape, and I lay down, and I said, I give you the game, but I've got to lie down. And then when we started again, and I won the next 4 points and sort of won, I said, all right, but he was really cross. It's the only time I've seen him really angry. Because I won by stealth. But he minded. He liked to win. I mean, although he was so, he's so modest in every way, but he liked to win. Of course, that made him a good opponent.
As a scholar?
Well, the wonderful thing about him is that he always knew everything. He never made me feel small for not knowing as much as he did. And yet I suppose, quarter to half of the time, we talk about literature or music, which he also knows a lot. He knows a lot about everything. It's very good company. very sweet-tempered.
But you were saying rather surprisingly unsure of himself.
Amazingly, what was to tell the story about
Yes.
Logan? Yes. Well, that's a very good example of how low esteem he holds himself. It was when I was on the board of directors at Covent Garden, had access to the Royal Box. I asked him to come to dinner and see one of the big Wagner operas. And I was going to drive him and the party down to the opera house. And when it was getting almost too late, he hadn't come. I rang him up, said, "Where are you?" And it turned out that what had happened was he'd come to my house, knocked on the door, not immediately received an answer, and assumed that we'd gone without him. Absolutely extraordinary. Amazing that we would have done such a thing. So we got him, had to speed all the way there, got there out of breath, but we got there all together. Had a good evening.
You mentioned music, which came up a lot at the beginning. I mean, you came to a college which is quite famous for its music.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy that side of King's?
Not really, because I wasn't. I always saw myself as a player. So apart from playing 2 or 3 concerts with David Wilcox, in his, I could say his dying years, just before he left, which I enjoyed very much, particularly a performance of the Brahms Requiem. It had a marvellous oboe part in it. Mind you, he was a difficult man. He was a difficult man to conduct, to follow.
Was he?
Well, he was one of those people, a circular beat, that you couldn't find the downbeat as you were watching. You know, I asked Stephen Cleobury to invite me to play. It's the last time I played it all seriously. And I asked him, not that I could play any concert, but you know, there's one weekend when the scholars are away, and instead of evensong, they have a little cantata concert. And I asked him if I could play a solo part in a Bach cantata. And for the whole term in the United States, I practiced it. Every single day I practiced. I almost got up to a point, something I needn't be ashamed of. That's about the last. But he is another man who is so modest in his manner.
Yes.
You wouldn't guess, because he has a wonderful beat. And he knew how to test for the balance, and a wonderfully efficient performer with a choir and orchestra.
Yes, indeed. Coming back to King's, we've really only talked about Frank and Edmund. Were there any other people you were close to?
Adrian Wood has been my real friend.
He was an economics research fellow in the 70s, wasn't he?
That's right, and he's an extremely clever man, and the work he did as a PhD student is still alive and part of the literature, and is quoted as a separate source in my book. And my other friends, Christopher Prendergast is a close friend of mine. But we don't, we chatter about the stock market, but he doesn't have any knowledge of. Those are the main people.
You were saying, I was mentioning that I was hoping to write something about Cambridge, and you said that there was a coda.
Oh, I said, I meant it had a, that might be difficult to understand, but it had a character. I'm not sure I didn't say a smell, or
yes,
an
aura.
aura. It has a feeler about it, which is unlike any other thing, and very unlike Oxford, of course, and very much less friendly. So I find it a sort of definitely unfriendly atmosphere.
Did you?
People will walk past you without looking at you.
Kitty was saying the same thing just now.
We both felt it very much. I mean, I think more even for her, because, you know, Kitty's not academic at all, and didn't have any formal education after a certain age, but she's extremely well read, and very interesting. She's very interesting about what she reads, but you couldn't talk to anyone in Cambridge. It's a cast of mind that people wouldn't recognise.
So you didn't have a real sense of fellowship at King's?
No. I can't say that. We had a little bit of, towards the beginning of the time I was there was a little group of people who were merry together. Charles Hope and Caroline Elam and Adrian. And there was a historian, Martin Lyons.
Oh yes, I knew Martin.
He
was elected the same time as I was.
We were a merry group.
Tony Jutt? No, he was...
He was not part of that group, of course.
At the same time. And John Dunn?
John Dunn I got to know much later. And he's been a very dear friend for the last 8-9 years.
Having looked at economic and other trends over the last 30-40 years, do you think we are doomed?
Doomed?
Yes. I mean, that's to say population, ecology, etc., etc.
Yes. Well, I certainly think, and that's quite exactly consistent with what I've said, I certainly don't think it will happen all by itself. If the market forces are not going to solve the problem. No, absolutely. Some great process of whether it happens naturally or unnaturally, but some active, we'll call it collaboration, but the world's problems, which are serious, will not be solved by market forces alone, or even principally by them. Something else has to be done. And it's a very good question to ask. I mean, what's going on now? What seems like a major, well, it is a relatively major crisis, but it has come about because of deregulation. The banking and financial systems have been deregulated. There used to be controls on all these things. Thatcher and Lawson. And it's a thing which people don't remember or realise. But the whole financial system was deregulated in the 80s. And if it hadn't been, I don't think we'd be in this mess we're in now. Because they're only moving in, the central banks are only moving in very reluctantly. And, in my opinion, haven't moved in enough yet to see us through.
The other huge question is the shift of economic and political power eastwards towards China and Japan and so on. But
I don't think it's hit the people, it hasn't really got into people's consciousness yet.
No.
And the decline of America.
Exactly. I mean...
particularly.
A double process. one going down and one going up.
Yeah. Quite fast.
Very fast. I mean, each estimate of the time at which the Chinese economy will catch up with America gets shorter and shorter. It used to be 2050 or 2060. Now it's within a generation or less. And having been to China a lot recently, I've seen what's happening. It's just out of this world. Did you spend any time outside Europe and America?
No. I very much regret it now. But I haven't. And I have most of my professional, or a lot of them, allies are in South America.
Sounds like your grandfather who ran India from Whitehall. You sound a bit like the famous remark attributed to Sir James Fraser when asked if he'd ever met any of the natives on Trinity High Table, and fearing loss of face, he said, "God forbid." So,
give me that book. I want to show you.
Which one is it?
Well, the one right at the end,
This
called
one?
The India Office. Yes. I want to show you what he looked like in his prime.
The India Office. This is back to your grandfather.
Yeah.
Is that a portrait of him?
It's a photograph of him.
So we'll get him
Ah,
a very nice picture of him.
isn't it it's a good face, isn't it? Strong, humorous.
And in many ways one of the most influential people in your lives. In your life.
I think of him every day.
Hmm.
What he would have said about it.
Well, I think that's a very nice note to end on. So thank you very much indeed, Wynne. That was lovely.